Morning. My mom's eye doctor was widely known around the city as the best guy to do cataracts. So my mom regularly brags to her friends about how smoothly it all went for her when she had it done. Well, that man sold his practice a couple of years ago to this new doctor who's apparently very good with eyelid reduction surgery. I didn't know there was such a thing. But it's apparently when we age and our eyelids drip over our eyes. So a couple of years ago, she told my mom she should get this done. And so this year, my mom agreed. But the catch was that while her office is on the west side, she does this procedure in Maple Ridge. So there we were one morning, getting up at the crack of dawn to make the almost 2 hours drive to get to the hospital by 8:30. So we were number 2 on the list of 5 people slated for this on that day. And as my mom and I settled down into the waiting room with the lady ahead of us, number 3, this Chinese man, joined us in the waiting room just as that lady got called for her turn. Now, when you meet somebody for the first time, how many questions in before you're talking about what you do for a living? That's how we identify ourselves, right? At least it is for us of a certain age. Recently, I don't know what kids do these days. Recently, I met this teenager. I asked his last name, and he, looking rather concerned, "Why do you want to know?" So now, after we got to know each other better, he asked me, "Why do people ask that?" Isn't that fascinating? That family and clan doesn't really figure into the way this young person thinks of himself. We older folks always identify ourselves with our whole name, I told him. And of course, the other thing we say is what we do for a living. So it was this gentleman in the waiting room who told us we were in good hands because this doctor apparently made a name for herself with this eyelid procedure in New Zealand before moving here. Now, interestingly, the man didn't say what he did for a living right away. He didn't say until I asked. Maybe he didn't want to brag, or maybe because he was retired, he was 80, but like all Asian people, he could pass for 50. He worked, his work turned out to be very impressive. He said he was a doctor, the head of pathology of a teaching hospital in Hong Kong before retiring and moving here. So like my mom's eye doctors, he wasn't satisfied with just being a doctor. They all wanted to be the best doctor doing the thing they did. So like all of us, we don't just need to know where we fit. We also hope to be recognized in some way in our tribe, like head of pathology. We need to be seen. And that wasn't even the most impressive part. He said he came from a very poor family with 5 kids. There was no money for school. So after high school, he was very pragmatic with his life choices, laser focused on making a living. So he and one of his brothers both got scholarships to go to college, and it all worked out incredibly well, he says. I'm very grateful for my life, he tells me. But it seems retirement now is a new challenge for him, like all of us will discover eventually, if we build our identity on things that can go away. He needed now a new thing to identify with, a new calling card, now that he's not a working doctor. And so he says he tried golfing and he tried Chinese calligraphy. Now, when he says try, he means finding a teacher and paying money for lessons. So it's like college all over again. But I get it. It's like his work life. He doesn't just want to do something. He wants to be good at it. He wants a golf score or artwork that he can show people with pride. But nothing stuck, he says with some disappointment. But I finally found my thing, he says, is nature. So apparently he had a dog, and twice a day he would walk his dog by this park near UBC. When the dog died, he made a commitment, he says, to the dog and himself to keep walking twice a day. So it's a foresty park. My guess is that in the forest, he found the peace he didn't realize his soul has been looking for. He says he needs that solitude more than he needs his friends. So he doesn't socialize very much anymore. Now, I have so many questions about that, but it felt impolite to ask. Perhaps in the forest, there's no one he needs to compete with for being top dog, no one he needs to impress. So at 80 years old, he has finally found a place where he can be himself in his own skin. Or maybe the forest is a safe place to look inside for some firmer anchorage for his identity than something outside, like achievements and job titles that can be taken away, or very tiring to upkeep. So our passage today is the opening chapter from Paul's letter to the Colossians. Colossae was an ancient city in modern Turkey. It was the New York or London or Tokyo of the ancient world. For 400 years, starting at about 500 BC, because a major trade route ran through it, so location, 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 as they say, it was on the map until it wasn't. Because about 100 years before Jesus, the city Laodicea nearby aggressively went after the best city status. They lured away the businesses, and Colossae just faded into the background. It didn't help that within Paul's lifetime, it got hit with 2 major earthquakes. The second one around the year 60. So most people just moved away after that. It limped along a little bit longer before it just completely disappeared off the map altogether. Goes to show, nothing in this life is permanent. So now, the church in Colossae started when one of the merchants there went to Ephesus for business and happened to meet Paul. And meeting Jesus through Paul changed his life. He went back home and helped start the church there. That guy's name is Philemon, the same guy who gets one of his letters from Paul included in the Bible, because God turned one of his personal problems that he had with a runaway slave into a defining growth moment. So much so, I guess, that everybody thought that story needs to be preserved in the history books, because Jesus changes everything about how we live. Now, Paul writes to Philemon to challenge him to love like Jesus, implying the Christian thing to do is not only to forgive the runaway slave, but actually to radically transform that master-slave relationship the way Jesus would. That if he was serious about his faith, he would go all in and give the slave his freedom. So master and slave would now live under the same roof as brothers. Because for Paul, once we meet Jesus and become a child of God, Jesus changes everything about us, how we think, how we act, and what we care about. Now, shortly after Philemon met Paul and went home and got his house church started, Paul hears something that makes him want to write, to correct some kind of theological drift, to remind them what is true north in their new life as Christians. Paul doesn't really say what went wonky, but scholars think it's the thing that always happens, that Christians living in a world with many gods often would mix in other values and ideas into their faith, and Christian values and practices either get diluted or they become a kind of religious smorgasbord. So Paul writes to reset their compass. And what we get here in chapter 1 from a younger Paul is one of his gold medal paragraphs in the Bible, right up there with Philippians 2 or bits of Romans, words that people make posters out of. Now, scholars call this the Christ chapter, where Paul says Jesus is the center and identity anchor for Jesus' followers. Jesus holds everything together, he says in verse 17. And Jesus makes sense of everything about the human condition, about God, and about life with God. That getting to know Jesus changes everything. Now, as good as that sounds, if we were looking for a slogan for a TV ad, Jesus changes everything for us. But what does that really mean in ways that matter? I've always loved this chapter. What's not to love? It's a grand hymn about Jesus. I used to memorize bits of this on my singing trip and write it out when people asked me to sign their programs. So I would certainly recommend this to you, to read and imprint this chapter into your soul. But when I read this chapter again this time around for the sermon, I asked the question I always ask God when I Bible study: so what? I ask it politely. What does it matter to us and our soul when we say that Jesus changes everything for us? It took a couple of days. Then I think I got it when I processed my conversation with that man waiting for his eyelid procedure. I realized the first and foundational thing Jesus changes for us is how we see ourselves. That by coming and dying and by rising from the dead, he shows us what we're worth to God. Like that, when we anchor who we are in Jesus, we discover our true worth as God's masterpieces, that we matter to God in ways that blows our minds. When we realize how God sees us and we begin to see ourselves the way God sees us, everything changes for us from the inside out. Just like being the best at cataracts and eyelids reduction and being the head of pathology changes how those three doctors think of themselves and carry themselves at cocktail parties. It's the sixth Sunday after Pentecost, the day when the Holy Spirit moved into the world to carry on where Jesus left off. And human beings, us, now live with God as our resourceful roommate and our personal life coach to nudge us along in the process of us becoming like Jesus when we pay attention to him and we allow him access to our human operating system. That's how important we are to God, how much he enjoys our company, that he wants us to do life together. The Spirit empowers us from the inside out to fully live into our new identity as children of God, which bit by bit transforms the way we love other people. And Paul calls love the fruit of our friendship with God, so people can experience the sweetness of God's blessing and kindness and approval. And we are God's plan A for saving the world from mutual destruction. So here's a prayer for the sixth Sunday after Pentecost. Let's pray that together. Ever faithful God, whose being is perfect righteousness, you reconciled into your Son with the helpless and the needy, with those we would ignore or oppress, and with those we call our enemies, so that we, as your hands of love, may serve all people and sit at the feet of those who need our compassionate care. Amen. My family moved to Canada when I was 12. On the third day, we bought a house in Burnaby. But then, the next year, we moved again, which was really rough on my social life. Having left all of my childhood friends in Hong Kong to Burnaby, and I just started to make some new friends here when I had to start over again in high school in Vancouver, which, by the way, is the one where Dick Williams taught English. So it was lovely to catch up with him here again. Now, starting high school was especially lonely. For one thing, most of the kids show up on day one with all of their buddies from elementary school. They traveled in packs. That leaves the rest of us, like me, who didn't know anybody, still learning to speak English, and had the social skills of a root vegetable. So my friends, if you can call us that, that's a couple of loners by my locker, sort of acquaintances by proximity. And that would have been my very sad high school story if it weren't for the orchestra. Now, the orchestra didn't just open me up to a world of fantastic music, but it gave me an identity and a tribe in the jungle, a refuge from the lions, a place where I was literally seen and heard. And it was sort of an accident. The night before the first day of school, I was filling out this form asking me to choose an elective. I had to go ask my mom what an elective was. My mom says, it's good to play an instrument, pick orchestra. That's how I found myself on the first day of school, lined up against the wall with all the other grade 8s. Me, having an anxiety attack as the teacher, went down the line asking us one by one what instruments we played. I didn't play any. I didn't even know what the instruments were. So the boy ahead of me said, violin, and then it was my turn, and I froze. Then I heard him lean into my ear and say, just say violin. I did. That's how I came to play the violin. Now, in the 70s, that school had the only orchestra, string orchestra in the city. So being in the orchestra was like being on the endangered species list. It was not hip like being in the band or singing in the choir. You know, orchestra kids move around with an aura of mystery, carrying our oddly shaped instrument cases like teenage antique dealers, clutching onto our music from dead composers with exotic German and Italian names. But it was an identity for us, that we belonged somewhere, we were somebody, we had a people. Like the brainy kids on the honor roll always studying together in front of the lockers, and there are kids hanging around down by the auto shop, or the jocks with their loud jackets with the big letter on it. So I was with the orchestra kids, albeit weird and mysterious, but I belonged there, I was known there, and I wasn't alone. Now, Plato thought there were 3 parts of the human soul. There's a thinking part of us, there's a feeling part of us, and there's a part he calls the thymos. That's the part of us that needs to belong somewhere, to feel safe and to be seen and to be appreciated. The thymos, it's where our self-esteem comes from. When Paul says Jesus changes everything, that crucially includes the way our thymos gets what we need to thrive, because that happened to Paul himself. He goes to town on this theme in Philippians, how before he met Jesus, he identified both as a proud Roman citizen and a proud Jewish person. That was his identity, what fed his thymos. That's why when he felt that identity threatened, whether by the empire trampling on his Jewish people, or from his own people allowing the cultural mishmash of the empire to water down the distinctness of his culture, he would defend it with the rage of a Roman general. But then Paul says he met Jesus, and that changed everything for him. When Jesus became the anchor of his new identity, and this change was so significant that he said none of his previous accomplishments mattered anymore. He had traded it all in to be friends with Jesus. That Jesus became the only person his thymos needed to feel esteemed. That meeting Jesus both clarified and enlarged his sense of who he is and why he mattered and to whom. And he would devote the rest of his life to fully live out into this new identity as a child of the Creator, loved by God, and to share that love with everyone who crosses his path, which is the theme of our passage today from the opening chapter of his letter to the Colossians. Jesus is the glorious new center that makes our thymos come alive. Paul says in verse 15, the Son is the image of the invisible God. The Message says, through Jesus, we can see God with our eyes for the first time. How good is that? Because, you know, when we look at someone, we don't just see what they look like, but we also see the way they look at us. I think Paul is saying that Jesus shows us with his face what God sees in us. And in that look, we discover a worth that we can find no place else on earth. That all the glory of God's magnificent creation also resides in our human soul. And that's what we hold in common in here as a community of Jesus' people. That however the world ignores us or demeans us, in here, we are royalty. I think we're now seeing all kinds of distress that we can get into when our thymos is starving to be seen. We have this epidemic of loneliness and rampant mental challenges, health challenges, and the many culture wars in society. It's rooted in the pain of our souls, and we do harmful things to ourselves and other people. Plato would say a root problem is that we don't know who we are or where we fit, or we feel no one cares if we live or die. And in a mad scramble to latch ourselves into something or someone for belonging and recognition, often we get ourselves in with the wrong crowd or we get scammed. When I was in college, gangs were coming into my old high school to recruit lonely kids. And the price of belonging was a blood oath to the gang life. One of the boys in my church got recruited. When he tried to leave, they threatened to come to his house and kill his mother and brother. So one night, one of the men in the church went and stayed over at their house, and the next morning, the mom sent the boy off back to Taiwan to live. Right now, there's a grown-up version of that going around the world. Nationalist politicians going after the votes of disgruntled people, recruiting, as it were, to unify their anger directed at the people they blame for their problems and the common need to be racially superior. A Stanford political science professor calls this the politics of resentment. Recently, I heard somebody say if the American Democrats want to win the next election, they need to pick a candidate with a mean streak. How sad, right? Not someone wise, not someone honorable, but someone who is willing to cut down other people for votes. And there's this thing the Chinese people call the pig butchering scams targeting lonely elderly people. Recently, two of my friends found out they each had a parent who got tricked out of hundreds and thousands of dollars of their retirement money. They each fell in love with someone they met online, and that someone talked them into investing money in some cryptocurrency website. And then they were told they had made $1 million. But to cash out, they had to pay a fee, something like $150,000, on top of what they put in already. One of my friend's moms sold all her jewelry and tried to borrow money from the other children. The other friend, his dad secretly took out a second mortgage from a predatory loan company. My friends had a hard time convincing the parents that they had been scammed. The lady who got tricked had been stuck on this grieving loop, telling her son constantly how stupid she feels, getting talked into doing something so not her. But then she says, for a few months, she was so happy, like a teenager falling in love. That's our thymos, getting us in trouble because it's starving for attention. When we don't get the love we need, we fall prey to fake saviors. We do regrettable things, ignoring our heads and even our better instincts. This is what I think Paul is getting at in verse 21, when he reminds the Colossians of their previous evil way of life. Now, Paul doesn't mean they were criminals. He's talking about evil in a very specific sense. Evil is trusting the wrong gods, the fake gods, and then living out those distorted and inhumane values of their materialistic and even violent religions. The evil is how the false gods and the religions, instead of saving us, enslaves us and shrinks and demeans our sense of self. They take advantage of our hungry thymos needing to be seen. And Paul says to his idol-worshiping friends that Jesus frees us from that bondage by showing us his face, how God sees us, and offering our thymos a safe place to anchor our self-esteem so we don't drift in space alone and lonely. And what we see reflected in God's face, it's love that enlarges our identity and esteem that changes the way we get out of bed in the morning and for what purpose. Now, back in verse 4, Paul commends the Colossians for reports of the faith and love. The message says the line of purpose in your lives never grows slack, tightly tied as they are to your future in heaven, kept taut by hope. I love that picture of a taut rope that anchors our identity on Jesus. It is as if we're water skiing behind Jesus. Because in that situation, when the slope slacks, we sink in the water. It shouldn't surprise us that our new identity in Jesus takes a while to get used to because our old programming is deep. Not unlike how it usually takes a while for adopted kids to find their place in their new families, to feel safe, and to feel like they belong. As human beings, we drift. It's what happens, especially when life gets hard. The Princess of Wales, William's wife, Catherine, says when she was battling cancer, she lost her sense of self and didn't know who she was. She's a princess. And even the identity tether of a princess can become slack in the rough waters of real life. One of the first things I trained to do in singing lessons was to use my breath to expand my rib cage. The challenge was to keep the thing expanded during the whole song. And my teacher explains the moment we stop thinking about it, it will deflate. Just like if you hold up your arms with your eyes closed, it just takes a few seconds before your arms would droop if we're not thinking about it. Staying close to God requires regular checks on the tether. We need to tug on it and keep tugging on it to feel God pulling us into Him. Because the moment we doubt God is holding on to us, our minds will go nuts. Our imaginations run wild and we'll start looking for something else to latch onto, like a drowning water skier. So that old gentleman in the waiting room asked what I did. And he became fascinated with my wild career change from engineering to pastoring. He couldn't believe I would do something so risky. I was much more practical about my career, he says. I'm not like you. You are a free spirit. Oh, no, I'm not, I told him. I need financial security as much as anyone, and that's why I had a hard time choosing music as a career. It was not an easy decision to go work in the church, but I told him, if I'm going to tell people that God is trustworthy, I feel like I need to know that for myself, that He is. Well, you have a calling, he says. Sure, kind of, but probably not in the way he means. I don't think some of us are somehow destined to become Christian or pastors, and some are not. For me, it's just like God calling me to Himself, so I can see myself the way He sees me, inviting me to a larger life than I could ever have imagined for myself. I think He's calling out to everyone with the same invitation. I heard God calling me in His voice in kindergarten through the teachers who told me about God, and in kindergarten, He sounded like a really good idea. And then as a nerdy, geeky, lonely kid moving around high school with my violin and my cello in tow, when I graduated from engineering for the first time, my immediate goal in life was to earn enough money to buy my dream car because my thymos wanted to be seen driving a Porsche. But then accidentally, I got recruited by that singing group, and they showed me how to anchor onto Jesus. You know the things I do every time I come here? I would never have thought I could do these things if not for the people in the singing group who told me I could sing, and a professor at Regent, who is a writer, told me I could write. It's God showing me the me He made. Jesus calling me, as that man puts it, changed everything about my life. It's what this winner of a cooking contest show said to the judges. He wanted to thank them for recognizing his love and talent for cooking. Thank you for seeing me, he told them, and then everybody started crying. Being Christian can be about so many things, highfalutin things, that we can get lost in the intellectual jumble. But at the heart of it, Paul says, the thing Jesus shows us with His life and death and resurrection, it's how God sees us. And He loves what He sees. and we matter greatly to our Creator. That's what keeps our faith taut. It's less about us holding on to God, but remembering that God is holding on to us, that He always sees us. We just need to tug on that tether once in a while to remind ourselves that God is never far from us. Jesus changed everything about our identity by giving us a secure place to anchor our thymos. And we're all in the process of learning to walk in those new shoes. And Paul invites us to unhook our thymos from the things that are not working for us and just lean into God, because the way Jesus shows us how God sees us. And that is Paul's instruction in chapter 3 for how we live into our new identity in Jesus. I hope you own a copy of the Message, because it's wonderful. And this is how Eugene Peterson hears Paul in chapter 3. So, if you're serious about living this new resurrection life with Jesus, act like it. Pursue the things over which Christ presides. Don't shuffle along, eyes to the ground, absorbed with the things right in front of you. Look up and be alert to what is going on around Christ. That's where the action is. See things from His perspective. Your old life is dead. Your new life, which is your real life, even though invisible to spectators, is with Christ in God. He is your life. When Christ, your real life, remember, shows up again on earth, you'll show up too. The real you, the glorious you. Take a moment, begin a conversation with God. A blessing for learning to hold on and let go. Let go. Let it all go, except, of course, when you can't. Living in the present is nice in theory, except when you're in pain. So let's bless that tension, the push-pull of wanting to let go, sometimes needing to let go, and also needing to hold on. God, sometimes it feels like a better person wouldn't be like this, tethered to so many hopes and fears and expectations. Blessed are we when we yearn for connection and love and touch. Blessed are we when we hunger for the beauty of life itself and the people to fill it. Blessed are we when we're unable to say, I'm letting it go, because we feel like we'll be washed away into an ocean of nothingness. Teach us to hold on to the truths that enliven our spirits and fill our souls and loosen our grip on the painful untruths, like that we are alone or unlovable, or that desire itself is the enemy. Teach us to hunger for what is good and be filled. There'll be no easy additions and subtractions. We will lose and we will gain, and almost none of it will make much sense at the time, and it forces our hands open. In the ebb and flow of wins and losses, comings and goings, we look for divine love in the mystery of it all. The stubbornness of flowers that still smile at us at the grocery store, and the need for endless small reminders that the pain of it all, the comedy of it all, keeps us wide awake. Amen.